Chapter 15 is on the special senses. In chapter 13, you were introduced to touch, which is one of those general senses mediated by general receptors. But here we're going to be looking at more specialized sensory receptors. So they're not like modified nerves of general receptors. So when you learned earlier in life about the five senses, they weren't separating the two individual senses in the ear, which are hearing and equilibrium. So I guess you could say in our case, there's kind of six senses, five of which we're going to be covering in this chapter. So vision is due to photoreceptors in the retina, specialized receptors. Taste is gustatory receptors. Smell is olfactory receptors. Hearing is specialized mechanoreceptors that are located in the cochlea. And finally, equilibrium is also mechanoreceptors that are located in a part of the inner ear called the vestibule and the semicircular canals. So the first sense that we're going to talk about is vision. And in the eye is where 70% of the sensory receptors are located at. And half of the cerebral cortex is involved in visual processing. And remember, you learned that perception occurs in the occipital lobe, which is the visual cortex. So most of the eye is enclosed and protected by a fatty cushion and a bony orbit. The accessory structures of the eye include things like the eyebrows, which help to shade the eyes from sunlight and prevent sweat from trickling down into the eyes. The eyelids are technically called palpebrae, and they're separated by the eyelid slit, which is called the palpebral fissure. And underneath each of the eyes are what are called conjunctiva. There's a palpebral conjunctiva and a bulbar conjunctiva. There's a conjunctiva sac. And the conjunctiva sac would be where a contact lens would sit or where you would administer eye medications. So the conjunctiva is really a transparent mucous membrane that can be infected and cause things like pink eye. And under the anterior surface is the palpebral. And would be underneath the anterior surface of the eyeball is the bulbar conjunctiva. And that's going to cover the white of the eye. The one that goes underneath the eyelids is called the palpebral conjunctiva. So we've talked about the conjunctival sac. The lacrimal apparatus is what we're going to talk about on the next slide. And then after that, we're going to go over the extrinsic eye muscles. And these extrinsic eye muscles, they are controlled by cranial nerves. There's actually 3 cranial nerves that you learned about in chapter 13 that control these. And they allow us to turn our eyes left, right, up, and down. So we see the accessory eye structures on this slide that were just mentioned. So things like the eyebrow, the eyelid, the conjunctiva, the palpebral conjunctiva specifically. The palpebral fissure is the slit between them, and the bulbar conjunctiva. Again, the conjunctival sac would be where you would put your contact lenses in or administer medication. The next slide is showing the lacrimal apparatus, and we look at the lacrimal apparatus. This is what is constantly keeping fluid on your eyes at all times. So it helps to cleanse and moisten and lubricate the eyes. So what happens first is that the lacrimal gland is going to secrete tears, which is lacrimal fluid. The tears enter the conjunctival sac on the lateral side of the eye via excretory ducts. Those tears flow from the lateral side to the medial side. And here you can see at the lacrimal canaliculus is where those tears are going to enter, and they drain from there into the lacrimal sac, and that empties into the nasolacrimal duct, which goes into the nasal cavity. So, interestingly enough, when there's excess lacrimal secretion, so excess tears, spilling into the eyelid, that could fill the nasal cavity, as you could imagine. And that's what can cause us some nasal congestion or the sniffles. So the lacrimal gland is going to drain into the nasal cavity. And we've gone over the flow of lacrimal fluid. So this is a dilute saline solution containing mucus, antibodies, and a lysozyme. Linking is what's going to spread the tears towards what's called the medial commissure. And that fluid empties into the lacrimal canaliculi. So the tears drain into the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct. Our next slide is showing the extrinsic eye muscles. And this is these are accessory structures. The 6 different muscles are listed for you in this table. First of all, we have 4 rectus muscles. We have the lateral rectus, which would be on the lateral side of your eye, on the outside. So it moves the eye laterally, and it's controlled by cranial nerve 6, which is the abducens. And notice it's the only one controlled by the abducens. We then have the medial rectus, which would be on the inside of the eye. And the medial rectus is going to move our eye medially, and it's controlled by the oculomotor nerve. So notice that 4 out of 6 of the extrinsic eye muscles are controlled by cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve. We then have the superior rectus, which is on the top of the eye. We can see it in these different views here. And it elevates the eye and turns it medially, also controlled by the oculomotor. At the bottom of the eye is the inferior rectus muscle. And the inferior rectus muscle is going to depress the eye, turn it downward, and also turn it medially, controlled by the oculomotor nerve. So basically, out of the 6 muscles, notice that 3 turn them medially, these 3, and the other 3 all turn the eye laterally. So if all 6 are working correctly, the eye should be able to look straight forward. If there's problems with that, then we get some what's called strabismus, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So we talked about the inferior rectus. Then there's 2 oblique muscles. So as you know, that means it's kind of like a diagonal. So there's the superior oblique muscle and the inferior oblique muscle. So those 2 muscles are going to elevate the eye and turn it laterally for the inferior oblique, controlled by oculomotor. And then the last one is going to depress the eye and turn it laterally, and that's controlled by the trochlea. This slide shows homeostatic imbalances for vision. Our first one is diplopia, and that's double vision, where a person cannot properly focus on images of the same area of the visual field. The next one is called strabismus, or cross-eyed, and there's a couple different ones. It's due to external eye muscles, which we'll talk about, or which we just talked about on the last slide. And it can occur when the eye rotates medially more than it should or laterally more than it should. If it rotates medially more than it should, it's called internal strabismus. If it rotates laterally more than it should, then it's called external strabismus.